You can't touch it, but it's part of the very fabric of the universe, and if you get on the wrong side of it, it will kill you.
Electricity is such an essential part of our lives that it is nearly impossible to consider life without it. But we often forget how dangerous it truly is. And it is these sorts of lessons from history that we ignore at our own peril. Death has been following Joe all day. Many of his closest calls have been sheer bad luck. But when death finally catches him, Joe will have no one to blame but himself. For he could have avoided it if only he paid attention to the epic history all around him. Next, we'll find out how burial, a tradition as old as humankind, can sometimes go wrong. Horribly wrong. History can teach us so much about our modern world. We know how much electricity gives us, but we might forget the power it also has to take away. It is ignoring these lessons that has led to Joe's untimely death. Under the surface of everything around us lies a series of incredible discoveries and adventures that have delivered these things into our everyday lives. Most of us, like Joe, pass each day without ever knowing these stories. Joe led an ordinary life compared to those who came before him, giving shape to the world that he took very much for granted. But Joe does have one thing in common with all these historical figures. They have all died. But epic history doesn't end with death. There is still one more journey to take into what comes after death. Burial. A practice that goes back to the beginnings of mankind.
When we look at the most ancient of human ancestors, say the Australopithecines, there's no evidence for burial. But it's really with humanity, with the rise of humanity and the idea of a human culture, that we see the idea of burial developing. Look at the animals we live with, our pets. While we may bury them today, on their own, they would just, they would pass away and they would decay. Today, with large numbers of people, there's obviously a hygienic need, but there's no inherent reason to bury people, except for the feelings we have for each other, that we share as members of societies.
Humans have been burying each other for about as long as we've been around. But after hundreds of thousands of years of practice, the procedure can still sometimes go terribly wrong. In 1894, a young woman named Eleanor Markham died in a town near Syracuse, New York. Before her death, she had claimed to have heart trouble. When she slipped into unconsciousness and her heart stopped, there was no reason to doubt she was anything but dead. She was officially declared so, and the undertakers closed the lid of the coffin when movement was felt from within. Eleanor Markham was still alive. She claimed she was conscious the entire time, yet powerless to move or to cry out. A fate like Miss Markham's was so feared by people that intricate mechanisms were created to avoid such a plight.
Americans and Europeans were so concerned with this that they began to create ways of alerting the world that an individual had been buried prematurely. And they range from sort of spring-loaded coffin lids so that the individual, upon awakening and realizing they were in a coffin, could press a button and the lid of the coffin would pop up, which must have been terrifying to everyone around them, to much more involved contraptions for individuals who were already fully entombed, where there would be air tubes, there might be speaking tubes, there could even be systems of bells, and some of these were apparently so sensitive that individuals who were truly dead and had been entombed, as their bodies decomposed, it would sometimes set off the alarms, which must have been that much worse for the survivors, who now thought that their loved one was actually alive and had been entombed, and they go to check, and it turns out that truly they're dead, but they're in much worse shape than had been expected.
Thanks to modern medical science, premature burial is a thing of the past. As is Joe, who has moved on to be with his many ancestors. Those brave and hardy souls whose discoveries and adventures helped create our world today. Joe's story may have been short, but it is still important. Every story counts. Whether the tales are of hardship or daring, of wonder or surprise, everyone plays a role, no matter how large or how small, in the epic history of everyday things.
Exciting episode of